Okay. So, since we've kind of gone through different types of spirits and the way that they live and reside and where they are, uh, the next stuff is a little bit more practical in nature and has to do with how our obligations to our spirits and therefore to our world sort of work. Because as we engage spirits, they're part of the world around us. So that's going to impact how we engage the world around us as well, as opposed to just being a one-to-one thing with those individual spirits. The most basic sense of obligation is if you have a pact or an agreement that you've made. So you call upon a spirit, and well, actually, before talking about what a pact is, let's talk about what a pact isn't. The classic Hollywood version of a pact, or sort of the 1970s black magic version of a pact, is you call on the devil and you sell him your soul, and you're damned to hell for eternity in exchange for the hot cheerleader or the football quarterback, the sports car, and the high-paying job. And then somehow the devil tricks you so you die early and don't get to enjoy it anyway. I don't know that I've ever met a magician who has sold his soul for something. That seems like a rather silly idea. But pacts still come up in spirit magic. A pact is just an agreement. So you call upon a spirit, you say, hey, bro, I want this thing. Help me out. And the spirit's like, okay, give me a bottle of whiskey, a cigar, and a plate of peppers. And so you give the spirit those things. The spirit's like, awesome, this is what I like. I'm going to go do what you asked. Now, sometimes when you make a pact, there's going to be some offering that you make initially, like a sort of a good faith down payment on what you're asking for. But generally, what your part of it is that you're going to give the spirit is something that you give after the work is done. I think it was you, Justin, at Jason's class, where you asked about Saint Expedite, and Jason was like, you already gave him the pound cake before he did the thing. Why is he going to do the thing now? So some spirits can't work until you start the process of giving them something. And this is something where I had worked in that model of here's an offering because I want you to work with me, and I'm going to pay you the rest of this when you've done the job. And I've known a lot of magicians who work that way. It was actually Gordon was the first person where I kind of got any information where it was coming from a spirit of there's a reason for that. In him working with Tobias, our lodge's familiar, Tobias told him that he will do the work we want him to do, but he can't start the work until he receives some offering. And I think part of that is not all spirits have immediate agency within our world. They need something to bridge that agency into our world. And we can see that in some traditional forms of magic, where some of the offerings and some of the things that are given to spirits are given to help them come into the world in order to be able to work. And so when you give a spirit an offering as kind of a down payment on an agreement, I think part of that is it's giving them that foothold in the world to start working. When you give them the final payment for the pact, then that's you making good on whatever your part of the agreement is. Now, just like when dealing with people, it's important for you to follow through on the things that you say you're going to give to a spirit. Yeah, like if you tell a spirit you're going to give it something and you don't, then you are risking your reputation with that spirit, and then also with the rest of the spirit world, where they might say, well, okay, this person offers stuff, but they don't follow through. They don't give the thing that they say they're going to give. So spirits may become less likely to work with you, less likely to do what you ask. You also have the spirit creates some situation for you. It gives you something. it's like a parent, where the parent's like, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of it, or I gave you your car, I can take your car away. So it's like, there's no reason to assume that if you don't give the Spirit what it is you say you're going to give it, that it may not continue to facilitate what you've asked it to help with, or it may take away what it helped you with, or it may try to exact something from you in some different way. There's an issue I've talked about a couple times where there was a spirit I was working with. It was like kind of an important thing to get done. I didn't have a real relationship with that spirit or with the spirits in that spirit's culture. And so the spirit's like, why would I help you? I don't know you. And so I was like, well, we worked together before. He's like, yeah, one thing when you were young, whatever. And so I'm like, all right, I'll give you these things. He's like, how do I know you're going to do that? And so I offered that if I didn't follow through, the spirit could harm me in a particular way. And so the spirit sort of did what I asked for, and it kind of took time, and then eventually it came to fruition completely. And over time, I made payments of the things that I said I would give. But there was one particular thing that the spirit and I had talked about, and that the spirit apparently wanted particularly, that I was kind of like, this is a little weird, I'm not sure I want to do this. And so we kind of went back and forth. I'm like, yeah, you kind of did what I asked, and it took a really long time, and I gave you all these other things, and you did get it done, but like you got paid all this other stuff, and you don't need this thing. He's like, that's the thing I want. You said you were going to give me that thing. Do it. And so then eventually it gets to where the thing that I told him he could do to me, he did. Basically, made my left eye swell up for well over a year. And so I went to 3 different doctors. They couldn't do anything about it. I went to other spirits, and spirits, like the angels I talked to, are like, I can relieve like the annoyance of it. I can make it not hurt, but I can't take it away. Like, you have a pact with a god, and you didn't follow through on it. Like, we can't undo what gods do. And so, which reflects the hierarchical element of things, that angels are saying they're not powerful enough to undo a curse from a god. And so I would take one of the things that I had offered to the spirit and apply that to the eye, and that would create some relief and make it a little bit better, but also give me like a bunch of weird visions. And so then eventually I went ahead and did the thing that the spirit wanted, and within like a week it was gone. And so suffice to say, I don't work with that spirit. Like, we are not bros. But you want to follow through on your agreements. And so, like, spirits that you're tighter with, that you have a good relationship with, yeah, sometimes if you miss following up on something, it's just like with your friends, you miss following up on something, they're going to forgive you and kind of let it go. But if it becomes a habit, then that's going to be a problem, and those spirits are not going to be your bros anymore. And so you've got to make sure that you keep that up and keep up with whatever your pacts and agreements are. If you have something where you have a devotional relationship, regular offerings are important to that devotional relationship. Now, in the book, I talk about how with some spirits you don't want to have a devotional relationship. You don't want to make regular offerings because the relationship should be transactional. But there are other spirits where it's appropriate to have that relationship. And if you want them to sort of have a constant influence and regularly be helping out with things and looking after you, then having those regular offerings is an important part of that. It's kind of like you want them to regularly be in your life and regularly be influencing things for you and kind of having your back, so you need to regularly take care of them as well. And so that relationship is a little bit different than a pact, which is more of like a specific thing for a specific thing. There's also the idea of recognition and right relationships. Particularly the dead want your attention. They want you to know they're there. They want you to have some sort of relationship with them. But there's other spirits that will want that too. And so just the act of recognizing them, the act of interacting with them, is something that's going to help build that relationship with them. And so you want to make sure you're keeping that interaction on a regular basis if they're a spirit that you want to deal with regularly and you want to have involved with you regularly. As far as right relationship goes, this is something that gets involved with really sort of any level of spirit, but it's going to look different with different types of spirits. So like with nature spirits, don't go litter in the spaces that they have domain over. With fairies, don't break contracts with them. With angels, don't call on them and blaspheme things in front of them. You want to respect what the culture, what's important to that spirit is, and acknowledge that in how you're interacting with it. Now, a place where this gets kind of interesting is when working with the dead, because part of the process of dying is certain elements of your life die. So, old age and the dying process are something that we often associate with sickness, but conversely, you can also associate it with healing, in the sense that all of those things that your soul has accreted that are negative or a sickness for your soul, they get sort of leached out into the body as the body dies. And so the dying process is one by which that core part of yourself heals and recovers and becomes more purely itself as the physical vessel begins to die and become impaired. With that, the core parts of you, or the core parts of like your family or your friends that are deceased, they stay there. They're still that person. But biases and things that are there because of how they've been influenced over time, because of things they've seen in the media, things they've experienced in their life, things that are based on trauma, things that are based on them being taught wrong-headed things, those are parts of the things that impair the soul and that get leached out as part of the dying process. So when you're dealing with the dead, you're not dealing with some perfect being or something that's super enlightened. You're still dealing with your great-grandparent or grandparent or parent, but they're going to be filtered a little bit. So some of the things that may have seemed important to them in life are probably not going to be important. So one of the things that people ask me a lot is, if you had relatives who were against magic or who didn't like the idea of magic, can you interact with those ancestors through magic? And my answer is like, well, you can't really interact with them through not magic. So, so they've got to, on some level, accept if they want you to come hang out and talk to them, you're doing magic. They got to be okay with it on some level. But I think also some of that is stuff that gets leached out where they're not as concerned about those specific things. Some things where it's stuff about like particular preferences or decisions that you might make in life. They might not be things that they would have agreed with when they were alive, but it might not be as much of an issue when they're dead. The flip side of this is things that were at the core of them are still going to be there. So like when I talk to my dad and I'm like, well, I don't want to like help this person with this thing, this person's like problematic, my dad's still like, I get that that's you and that you don't want to be that person who's like going to help this person that you don't like, but you should be that person who helps this person you don't like. And so I'll help you with this thing, but it's going to help them too. The dead still have their personalities on some level, and you should still be able to recognize their voice, not necessarily in the sense of how they sound, but in the sense of what interacting with them is like, what their core feelings and values are. Those things are still going to be there. So like if you had an ancestor who wasn't hateful because of trauma or because they were raised badly, they're just hateful because that's just who they are inside, they're probably still hateful as a dead person. They're probably not the ancestor you want on your altar. But if you've got somebody who they grew up in the deep south in the 40s or 50s, and so they have some bigoted ideas, but those ideas are just because of the culture they grew up in. When you're dealing with the dead version of them, those ideas might not be there as strongly or might not be there at all because they have a different perspective, and whatever things impacted them negatively in life, they've kind of shed a lot of that. So you kind of have to look between what's that person and what's that person's baggage. And so the things that are that person, you still want to respect that when you're dealing with them. So like if you have an ancestor who family was really important to them, then they're going to want you to do good things for your family. And when they help you, they're going to want it to be in a way that helps your family. And when you come to them, they're going to want to know that you're still taking care of your family and still interacting with the family members that are important to them. If you have some ancestor you're dealing with who had something that was something that they left unfinished but that was super important to who they were, they're going to want to know about that thing. They're going to want you to update them and tell you about it. They're going to want you to work on that thing for them and help make sure it's resolved. So that's part of the right relationship element, is that you know what the nature and what the likes and dislikes are, what's important to that spirit that you're dealing with, and you recognize those things, and that becomes part of how you interact with them, just like it would be with a person. Let me need to talk about that.
You might be I'm sorry, go.
Could you give an example of what you recommend transaction, like a type of species or spirit, transactional versus devotional?
So, like, if you're dealing with a saint, you could deal with a saint on a devotional level. If you're dealing with your ancestors, you can be sort of quasi-devotional, where it's like a familiar or friendly relationship that's ongoing, but there still will be transactional moments in that. If you're dealing with an infernal spirit or like an aerial spirit, you probably want those things to be specifically transactional. Even angels, I would say you by and large want that to be transactional. You don't want that to be something where you've got necessarily like an ongoing devotion, because that starts to enter into the territory of like worship, and that can skew what the relationship is between you and them.
I was just going to say, for all that your ancestors do lose a lot of this stuff from their life, my grandfather, who was a lapsed Mormon, is very amused to have a priestess for a granddaughter.
Yes. And I'll say when I work with my ancestors, a lot of times they want Christian prayers. Like that's what they're familiar with. That's what they recognize. They want Christian prayers. So like they're okay with like working with them through working with pagan gods of the dead and prayers there, but they want prayers that from a Christian context to be worked in also. And a lot of times, like, their advice will be like, well, pray this way or pray that way. And so what's familiar to them is still going to be there, even if it's not like, but it's not as like hard and fast dividing line where they can't accept that something might be different than what's familiar to them. So, yes. I don't think of them as necessarily decaying shells. I think the world of the dead is. Yeah. I think the dead are. It's hard to say what happens after we die, because there's so many different interpretations from so many different places. In my experience, the dead want interaction and they want memory, but they don't cease to exist once they cease to be remembered. They're just maybe less accessible, and once memory has to be restirred for them. But I think there is some element of the dead that is some part of them that moves on and becomes something else, but there's some part of them that remains themselves. I know part of my praying for the dead involves praying to the river of memory, and praying for the guardians of the river of memory to make that accessible to my dead, so that they still have access to that. But I don't think that it's something that is a purely temporal thing. So even if there is that process whereby the dead forget or whereby the dead move on, I don't think you're engaging on a one-to-one time scale. So those processes can occur while you can still connect with them on some level. And there's also systems that look at it where the dead kind of have a life cycle, the way that the living have a life cycle, and part of that life cycle is becoming an ancestor, then becoming a more elevated ancestor, and then moving from that sort of divine-like spirit into being ready to move back into the world. So There's a lot of different ways to approach that. I think elements of those different ways all have like importance, but I don't think any of them quite hit on it entirely in and of themselves. So, I think part of really kind of talked about that already. Yeah, I guess one thing that when you look at the cultures of spirits, you have kind of two elements to look at there. There's like what we talked about before of spirits residing in a certain space, and so that type of spirit has a culture within that spirit world. Those spirits also are going to have a culture based on the humans that have interacted with them historically. So if you're calling upon a spirit from a particular culture, it's going to expect to be called upon in a certain way. It's going to expect to receive certain types of offerings because for whatever period of time, that's what it received. And so that becomes part of the culture of that spirit. It's not simply something where it's like, okay, these people had this culture, and this spirit was interacted with by those people, and so the spirit is just given those things because that was the people's culture. Over time, that becomes the culture of the spirit as well, and so the spirit has a certain right to expect to be interacted with in that way. So some spirits, that's going to be more important, where they're like, yeah, I want this thing, and this thing, because that's what I've received for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I like these songs because that's what's been sung to me for hundreds and hundreds of years. Other spirits are going to be like, whatever, just give me stuff that's cool. And so it's going to depend a little bit on the type of spirit. And I think it's going to depend a little bit on how cultures engaged that spirit previously and how connected that spirit was to that culture. So spirits that have a closer relationship because they're more like humans, it's probably going to be more important for them to have things that are culturally familiar to them. Spirits that reside in places that are further from humans, it's probably going to be less important for them to have things that are culturally familiar. When you're looking at that, though, that kind of comes into questions of whether or not something is appropriative. And I think within the magical community, appropriation is a weird topic because so much of magic is by nature appropriative, and to say like you can't appropriate anything would be like, well, there can't be any magic. And because even within a culture that has magic, that culture is borrowing things from other cultures and juxtaposing it against their religious terminology in order to create a magical system, and they're borrowing elements from their culture and repurposing it within their own culture in order to create their magical system. So magic is never just straight up what the regular cultural thing is. It's always somewhat shifting the way things already are. But when you're dealing with a spirit, there's some spirits where they're used to being dealt with in a way where certain people have access to them because those people have certain initiations, and so those are the people that get to approach them. And so to say like, hey, I read about you in a book, and I know how to call up spirits using these methods, so I'm going to call you up and try to make you show up and try to work with me, even though I'm not part of that system that works with you that way. It's a little rude. So like some spirits will be amenable to that, some won't, and you've kind of got to figure out with that spirit, with looking at that culture that spirit comes from, how that works for them. There's going to be other spirits that they might be able to be interacted with everybody, but they're interacted with through certain modalities, and in order to use those modalities, you're going to have to borrow things from other cultures in order to interact with the spirit the way that it wants to. In a certain sense, if you're doing that respectfully, and you're working with the spirit appropriately and in a way that's not offensive to that culture that the spirit comes from, that's probably being respectful and it's probably okay. If you're like hijacking the spirit or hijacking like the ritual elements and using them in some like bizarre way that's not kosher for whatever that culture is, it's probably not cool. But with people, you can always front like, no, that's not appropriation, it's okay, I'm not taking money for it, or I'm not telling people that I'm a Hopi shaman in order to try to get like street cred for being one. I'm just working with this Hopi spirit and mimicking these Hopi rituals. But you can't lie to the spirit about that. So that's another consideration when you're looking at how to approach the spirit respectfully. Like, if you are engaging with it in a way that's authentic and where you're drawing on things in a way that's respectful, the spirit's going to understand that you're doing that. But if you're just kind of taking whatever mishmash of stuff and trying to make the spirit be what you want it to be and make these rituals be what you want them to be without having an understanding of their context, without understanding their importance, without understanding what their nature is and what they're meant for, then there's a good chance that the spirit might not want to jive with that either, just like the people involved wouldn't want to jive with that and wouldn't be okay with it. I think another element of your obligation to the spirit world, particularly when you're dealing with spirits from the celestial realms as well as spirits from the earthly realm, is the idea of becoming a leader. And this is something that cultures that have an ingrained magical tradition have as part of it, that it's not just enough to go do some magic. You have to be part of the community, you have to be part of the culture, you have to be giving back in some way. And when you look at it, the spirits are giving stuff to you, and the spirits are part of that culture, they're part of that community. So it's a cyclical thing where they want you to say that, okay, you're kind of going to pay forward the work that you're doing with them in order to make sure that things are right for the rest of the culture around you that those spirits are also part of. This becomes particularly important when you're dealing with ancestral spirits, or when you're dealing with spirits that are particularly tied to a group of people. When those spirits have a concern for that group of people, they want to make sure that the people that are accessing them also share in that concern. It's a way for you to relate to the spirits better, but it's also a way for them to further accomplish the work that they want to do. Part of this, though, isn't just your relationship with the spirits, it's part of your relationship with the world, which again itself is a living magical organism that gives rise to these spiritual interactions. When you are working to be someone who's known in your community or who's a leader in your community who gives back to your community, you're working in a way that creates an interconnection with the world around you. More people understand who you are, more people know to look to you for certain things. You begin to develop more influence in the world around you. You draw more things into your proximity and therefore able to more efficiently impact those things. You gain more knowledge over what's around you because you're interacting with more of what's around you. And you begin to have more of a sense of the flow and movement of processes and energy and things throughout the world around you. So that's when you start to look at those things, that's kind of at the core of what becoming a magician or a wizard is. That it's this idea of you aren't just some guy who's off in a cave, disconnected from everything, talking to spirits. You're out working in the world, understanding how the world around you works, building connections in the world so that both through occult means and through mundane means, you're able to make changes to things around you, facilitate things, connect things. And so that gives you greater facility in working with the spirit world, because then they're able to work through your agency as well as working through their own agency as you're building up greater agency for yourself. Now, as far as actually living in this spirit-filled world, the spirit world doesn't have an on-off switch. So a lot of times when we think about magic, particularly the way magic has been dealt with through the magical revival up until very recently, there's this idea of like, okay, you go, you put on your special clothes, you do your special meditation, you do your special opening ritual, because that gets you in your headspace so that you disconnect from everything else and you're ready to do magic. You conjure your circle so that you're in a place that's outside of space and a time that's outside of time, which from historical magic around the world is not how it works anyway. Time and space are hugely important. You compartmentalize to the point where part of being a ritualist, part of being a magician is compartmentalizing your magical self from your day-to-day self. And anyone who's ever read any Llewellyn book knows that like half of the first chapter will be about your waking consciousness versus your magical consciousness. And that can be an important compartmentalization, but it shouldn't be there as like the core of what your magical practice is. You've got to recognize that you're always living in this world that is itself magical and does have these spiritual beings in it. And so you can't just say like, okay, I'm going to shut off and not engage with any of this, because you're limiting yourself, you're limiting those interactions. There could be things that are important to come through to you. There could be things that are important for how you're going to work, how you're living at the time, that you can't engage fully if you're just saying like, okay, it's only when I'm in my ritual space, it's only when I'm in my ritual clothes, it's only when I'm thinking about this that this is a thing. Because if you're doing that, you're not doing magic, you're living a fantasy life. You are engaging in something where you're building up a concept and maybe a thought form that you're going to engage with, but you're not engaging with the reality of the world around you. And that's really what magic is. Magic is understanding what the reality and structure of the world is, and then applying that to create the things that you need to make the changes that you want to make. And that's not something that you can do on a quarter-time basis. There does have to be some space where you can compartmentalize. There does have to be some space where you can say like, okay, I need to step away from things. I need to not be focused on the spiritual world. I need to be focused on my regular mundane work. I need to be focused on this thing that's happening in my life otherwise. Because if you're always focused 100% on the spirit world, that's a good way to run into obsession and madness. It's a good way to make your social functioning less capable. Because you're not in a place where mentally you're able to engage people the way that they're expecting to be engaged. You're not able to engage things in the way that you're normally going to have to in your life. But that doesn't mean that it should be something where you are only open to it on a very limited time basis. It should be something that's woven into your life in a fairly uniform, fairly consistent basis. And the more natural that becomes to you, the less problematic it becomes that it's something that's there on an ongoing basis, because you learn to live and breathe with the spirit world just like you do with the waking world. And it becomes something where it's not an obsession, because it's not this separate special thing that you're having to cut off. Along that vein, though, you also don't want to use magic or use the idea that we're in a world that's full of spirits as a way to try to make the world more epic and exciting. Because, again, probably fantasy world, probably not magic at that point. Take things as they are. Things will be interesting enough the way the world is. Again, you want to engage in what the reality of things are, so you don't want to search for things to be special in a way that leads to these flights of fancy. You don't want to search for ways to understand yourself as this special, elevated thing that is so different from everything else around you, because everything else around you is also part of this same magical world that you're a part of. You don't want to try to find a way to make your relationship or your interaction with the spirits so special and unique that it's just this adventure story, because by and large it's not. It's mostly going to be boring day-to-day stuff, but it's just going to be boring day-to-day stuff that's a little bit better, and it's a little bit easier, and it's a little bit more fulfilling, because you're engaging the world more completely. Not all spirits require you to interact with them. So you're going to have times where it's the tea metaphor. Maybe on Tuesday you want tea. Maybe on Wednesday you don't want tea. Because you wanted tea on Tuesday doesn't mean you have to take tea on Wednesday when someone tries to give it to you. The same thing with spirits. I had somebody who messaged me asking like what they should do because they saw this spirit and they think the spirit wanted to talk to them. And I'm like, well, did you want to talk to it? Like, is there a reason you have to? You don't always have to. So there's going to be spirits around that as you become more and more attuned to the spirit world, and as you interact with spirits more and develop those awarenesses in that sight, you're going to encounter things that you're going to see, and it's just like, okay, that's over there. There's this. I feel this spirit in this place. Okay, it's there. I'm here. Whatever. We're not doing anything where we have to interact with each other. It's just like somebody walks into a room. You might not know that person. You might be doing something else, and unless it's some situation where you need to interact with everybody that walks into the room because of whatever your job or role is in that room, maybe you don't need to interact with that random person that just walks in. Like, you're at a party, you're talking to 6 different people, and there's 10 other people over there. You don't have to go and talk to all 10 of those other people. Same thing with spirits. A lot of interacting with spirits, particularly spirits in the terrestrial sphere, is going to be very much like interacting with people in terms of how you decide how to work with them and what the relationship should look like. When you're trying to determine if you should interact or not, if it's not you creating the contact, is there some reason that you should be interacting with this spirit? Is the spirit actively trying to interact with you? And even if it is, do you want to? Like, is it something where you need to? And if you're unsure, maybe do some divination with the spirits you know and see if there's some reason you should be interacting with that spirit. Because, again, you don't just talk to every random person that walks up to you on the street. Then the other thing is keeping yourself and your space in kind of a healthy together manner. You're going to be open to a lot of different influences, interacting with a lot of different things beyond what you would normally be interacting with as you begin engaging the spirit world more. And so you need to be in a place where you're balanced mentally to do that, where you're not distracted by physical issues that are going to make it harder for you to keep that balance and harder for you to kind of take control of what's happening. You're going to want to make sure that your space is protected, that you're doing things to clear out influences that could be detrimental or influences that could be distracting to your work with the spirits that you want to work with. You want to make sure that you're keeping other spirits who you don't want influencing your life out of your life. And so exorcisms, wardings, cleansings, banishings are all important skills to develop. I believe David has a book on the subject. As also does Jason. So there's a couple out there to check out. And since both David and Jason are people who are pretty cool and come around to Blake, check out their books. But also working with the spirits that you do work with can help manage that. So if you've got a good relationship with your ancestors or with saints or with your gods, then they're going to kind of look out for what's coming into your space and what's not, as long as you're keeping that relationship going on an ongoing basis. They're going to try to filter out some of those things that would otherwise be coming in being problems for you. But they're also going to be resources you can turn to get more information if something's trying to come into your life and you don't know what it is or why it's there. The last sort of section of notes I have talks about magic itself and the actual practice of magic, but the second class is also largely on that.